Well, he had a plan. He wanted to see if the crocodile could help him get to the other side, but he didn't think he would help him if he just asked. So instead, he decided to trick the crocodile. Well, just as he called out, "Mr. Crocodile!" the crocodile heard him, and he had just been coming to the surface to try to get some relaxation, but he was beginning to grow lonely. So he came up, and he said, "Who's calling me? Was that you, Mr. Rabbit?" Well, of course it was the rabbit, and then he said, "Yes, it is. Would you like to come play?" Well, in this story, the crocodile didn't eat him, so they got out and they began playing. Now, don't ask me what kind of games they played together. I don't want to know. Okay, you two are the only perverted ones. Okay, well, they were playing their games, and as this began to go around, eventually the rabbit said, how many of you do you think that there are, Mr. Crocodile?" And the crocodile began to boast, "Well, there are a great many of us." The rabbit said, "I think there's more of us." "Well, that surely can't be. We're in the ocean that connects to the sea, and you're only on an island. There are surely more crocodiles than there are rabbits." And the rabbit said, "Okay, I would like to see. Do you think you could possibly get enough crocodiles gathered so that you could form a bridge to the mainland?" Well, the crocodile boasted and said, "Of course." So he said, "Wait here a moment." And he went back to the sea and he began to call together his friends. The entire time the rabbit was quite pleased because he realized something. The crocodile was stupid. Well, finally the crocodile came back with a group of his friends, and they were huge in numbers. And the rabbit said, "Very impressive. Could you form a bridge, though, so that I can count you?" Which they, of course, did. He said, "Now, Mr. Crocodile, you're going to have to get on your back, but please don't move, otherwise I will fall and drown. I'm going to have to jump across to count you all." Which they began doing. So the rabbit jumped on the first one. "Ichi, come on, you're doing through this. Ichi, ni, san, yon, go." And they continued counting on through this until finally he reached the other side. And he looked back at the crocodiles, and rather than thanking them for their kindness, instead he did something completely wrong. He began to make fun of them for being huge, stupid creatures. But he also made sure he wasn't on earshot first. So as he began to run inland, the crocodiles followed him on land, and whenever they finally caught him, a huge group of crocodiles began beating and biting at him, and eventually they ripped off all of the rabbit's fur, so that he was left naked, bleeding, and writhing on the beach. And even as he was in such great pain, the crocodiles went back to the ocean and they were laughing at it. Well, as he was writhing on the beach in the sand, which, by the way, is very painful on that kind of skin, and bleeding everywhere, a group of men came along, and one of them, while he was mean-spirited, pretended that he was kind, and he came up and he said, "Mr. Rabbit, what's happened to you?" And the rabbit said, "I got into a fight with some crocodiles and they beat me even though I tried. Please, can you help me? I don't know how to grow back my fur and the pain hurts so much." So the man, like I said, he was very evil. He decided that he would play a trick on the rabbit. And he told them, if you go and bathe in the sea, and then you come up on land, it will help you grow your fur back. And with that, the man walked away. And the rabbit was only too happy to try to agree. But as he got into the water, he felt that the salt from the water was so harsh on his skin, it hurt so much. But of course he kept going with it because he believed the man. And whenever he began to go on land, the wind, whenever it came, tightened his skin and made it crusty, and the pain was unbearable. And what had first started out as unagonizing pain, now was triple that. As he was there on the beach again, he cried even louder for help, and then finally another man came along. He looked suspiciously like the first one, though. And the man came up and he said, "What's the matter, Mr. Rabbit?" At first the rabbit would have nothing to do with him. He didn't believe him at all. And then one of the men said, "You poor thing. You must be in such pain. Please, what can I do to help you?" Rabbit looked up from his paws and he said, "I tricked the crocodiles." And he told them the story of what he had done and how he had been rude to the crocodiles, and basically he took responsibility. And the man said, "You do know that you're responsible for your own pain." "Yes, and I'll never lie again. I promise I won't. Please, just tell me what I can do to get rid of this pain." So the man told him about the pond right next to him, and he told him to wash the salt from his wounds, and to pick the cauliflowers inside of that and put them on the ground, since pollen would help his fur grow, and to rub himself through that. Well, even as the man said this, the rabbit began sprinting towards the pond, bathed himself clean, picked the flowers, put them down on the ground, and began rolling through them. And even as he was still rolling, his fur began to grow back, and he felt just as good as he had whenever it had all started. Now, running back to the man, he said, "Thank you! How did you do it? Please tell me, what is your name?" He said, "My name is Okuni Nushi no Mikoto." And immediately the rabbit bowed, because this man was actually known as and revered as a god, even though he was merely a fairy. But among those in Inaba, he was revered and treated as a god. And he said, "Why are you here?" "Well, the men you saw before me were actually my brothers. They're on the way to meet a beautiful maiden to see if she will marry them." And the rabbit smiled up at him and he said, "She won't marry them. Surely she will marry you." First, Okuni Nushi no Mikoto didn't believe him. And the rabbit was, after all, just grateful. And after he left, he soon overtook his brothers and met them at the woman's gate. And just as the rabbit had promised, the woman had refused each and every one of his brothers, came up to him and said, "To you I give myself." They were married very happily so. And Okuni Nushi no Mikoto continued to be known as a god throughout Japan until the day he died. And the rabbit also became very famous. As for the crocodiles, however, no one knows what happened. What's the moral of this? Oh, come on, this one's not hard. Is it?
Don't lie and don't drink.
Don't lie and take responsibility. If the rabbit had been honest with the first man, he probably wouldn't have been in as much pain. Whenever he was honest with the Okuni Nushi no Mikoto, he was told how to actually go about getting rid of that pain. Next up, we have the loving fox. Yes, it is what it sounds like. There was once a man who was married to a very beautiful and rich woman, and he was also rich and had himself, but he had one problem. He loved women entirely too much. And whenever his wife left on holiday one time, it was only hours from she'd been gone that he decided he needed another woman. So he went outside and he walked, and finally he found the most becoming woman he'd ever seen. So he walked up to her and he began caressing her and trying to talk with her. And as he did this, she kept trying to pull away. Who was this strange man? But finally he grabbed onto her and he began to whisper sweet nothings into her ear. And she continued trying to pull away, but he wouldn't have anything to do with it. And as he continued grasping her close, she finally relented and said, "Hello." And they began talking and they began kissing, and finally he said, "Take me back to your place." Well, she readily consented by this point, and they began walking back to her place, and he was very pleased to find that her house was so very close to his own. And whenever they came in that night, they consummated their love. And in the morning, he met the man of the house, who was, of course, her father. And her father, instead of being angry, actually introduced himself and said, "Hello, you were always meant to come here." Well, the man was so happy with the new woman that he stayed for many, many years, and he actually married her and had a son with her. While all of this was happening, however, his original family knew nothing about what had happened to him. So they continued to search and search, and finally they just began looking for the body, hoping for anything to be able to take back. But they weren't able to find a single thing. So finally they began actually carving out this form of a statue of the god, in hopes that the god would be able to help them find the body. Well, it continued on like this for some time, and eventually the man woke up one day, and he had his little son in his arms. He'd been granted a new son. He was so pleased with his new wife. She was wonderful. But even as he began to hold his son, a strange man came into his house and began to beat him with a stick. Well, the man handed off the son and began running away, and finally he forced himself out of the very small doorway that they had. And what greeted him was light. He hadn't seen this in years. What his family, however, saw was something that looked somewhat like a bamboo crawling out from under the shed. The man had actually been tricked. As he approached them, he said, "It's me!" And then they all realized it was him, the man they'd been looking for, the father of the house. Although he looked nothing like he should have, and he was still wearing the clothes he'd been wearing 13 days ago. For after all, what the man thought had actually been years had only been 13 days. And he walked up to his son, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "How are you doing? You should really meet my new son. After all, he's to be the new lord of the manor. He is my favorite after all. Don't take it by offense, though. It's only because his mother's my favorite wife." And he continued on and on like this, however. But as he continued talking, he looked towards his house, and he noticed it wasn't quite the house that he knew. And even as he was speaking, a group of foxes ran out from underneath of it. Turned out the man had actually married a fox. He was so ashamed of this that he actually spent the rest of his years being a very faithful husband, never cheated again, and he never spoke of that story again. What's the moral of this? Don't cheat. Don't be a hoe. Say no to bestiality is what I say.
Don't look at me.
I like how I've got the two over here with the ears. But I'm noticing there's spaces in between you, and I'm not sure how to interpret that.
It's because he's your friend.
Mhm.
Have you not seen the 1 or 2 spaces?
You know what?
That's bad.
Don't say that, she'll write fan fiction for it. Next up is the tongue-cut sparrow. Now this one's just a little bit different. The tongue-cut sparrow actually revolves around an old man. For you see, once upon a time there was this old man who was very, very kind, very, very hardworking. His wife, however, was quite the opposite. She was terrible in every respect. She always complained and nagged about everything, so much so that none of the neighbors would come around. She was just so irritating. Well, the man had one salvation. Every day when he went out to the fields, he knew that he would come home to something very pleasing. For you see, he'd never had a child to entertain him when he got home, but what he did have was a little sparrow in a cage. Now, every day whenever he got home, he would spend hours and hours with this bird, teaching it little tricks. It could bow, it could dance, it could do almost anything. It really could also even speak. Now, what sparrow can do that? Needless to say, the man was quite enamored with his little pet, and he spent so many hours with it. And his wife, of course, was jealous. She nagged about this and continued complaining that he spent all of his time with that bird, and it just got completely terrible, but the man completely ignored her. He'd heard years of her complaining, and he loved his little bird. Well, one day when the man went out to the fields, his wife went to go do the laundry, and she found that the rice paste that she was going to use as starch was missing from the bowl, so she began to call out, "Who stole my rice paste?" And she began yelling and going on and on and on, until finally the bird came out and bowed in front of the woman, and he said, "I'm sorry, I ate your rice paste. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was food left in a bowl for me. Please accept my apology. I didn't mean to." And as the bird continued apologizing, the woman began fuming. She was sure that the bird had done it on purpose, so she actually grabbed the bird by its neck, held it up, and said, "Such a pretty little tongue you had. I bet that's the same tongue that you used to eat my rice paste." And with that, she grabbed her scissors and actually cut off the tongue of the sparrow. It began to bleed everywhere, and it cried, and it couldn't talk any longer. It was in such writhing pain. Throwing it to the side, she didn't even care anymore. And eventually the bird was able to heft itself up and flew out the window to escape her. Well, that night, whenever the man came home, he began searching for his little bird. "Suzume-san, Suzume-san." That's what he'd name her after all. "Suzume-san." Well, the bird didn't fly to him as he was walking to the house. Growing frantic, the man began to run towards the door, thinking that his wife must have just locked the bird in the cage again. And when he walked inside, he found, "Suzume-san, Suzume-san." She wasn't in her cage. She was nowhere to be found. And his wife, being the liar and everything that she was, she said, "I haven't seen her." The man kept looking and looking and kept asking his wife, "Where is she? Where is she?" And finally she admitted what she'd done. She admitted to cutting off the bird's tongue and how she'd done everything to it. And the man began to cry about how cruel she was and his poor little Suzume-san. But there was nothing that could be done. And the wife was actually so cruel, she actually held up the tongue of the bird and said, "And this is what I did." Well, the man cried and he wept and he used the sleeves of his robes to wipe his tears away. He couldn't believe that his little bird was in such pain, and he wasn't there to help it. And that night the man couldn't sleep a wink. So he finally resolved that the next morning he would go out to try to find his bird. And then he was able to get a moment's rest. Well, early the next morning, before the sun had even risen, he packed up everything that he would need for a day's trip. A little bit of food and a little bit of things, as well as Suzume-san's favorite food. Then he went off looking and he began to call, "Where's my tongue-cut sparrow? Where's my tongue-cut sparrow?" And he went on for hours and hours looking at every bamboo grove he could find. After all, birds love bamboo groves. They began to call, "Where's my tongue-cut sparrow?" And finally, after hours and hours of looking, whenever he was ready to give up, a bird flitted down and said, "Hello, master, how are you?" And he was amazed. He found that her tongue had grown back and she could talk again. He said, "I'm so sorry for what happened. Please forgive my wife. She meant it, but I'm sorry." And as this all happened, the sparrow said, "It's okay, I forgive you. Please join me at my house." And the man readily consented, and as the bird began to fly, he followed her to this little gorgeous white house, and she invited him inside. As he went inside, he was greeted by not just Suzume-san, or as we would now call her, Lady Sparrow. He was greeted by the Lady Sparrow and her daughters, all dressed in beautiful crepe dresses. And and they all greeted him with such kindness. They'd heard wonderful things about him from her mother. Well,